Born on the 1st of March 1683 to Margrave John Frederick of Brandenburg-Ansbach and Eleanor Erdmuth of Saxe-Eisenach, Caroline of Ansbach lost her father at 3 years old when he died of smallpox. Her mother remarried but was widowed 2 years later. Caroline's mother died in 1696, and Caroline and her brother William Frederick were sent to stay with their half-brother Margrave George Frederick II. However, George Frederick was not interested in parenting young children, so Caroline was sent to her new guardians, Frederick, Elector of Brandenburg, and his wife Sophia Charlotte. Frederick and Sophia Charlotte became King and Queen of Prussia in 1701. Caroline received an extensive education, unlike anything she had experienced before. She and Sophia Charlotte developed a strong relationship, with Caroline being treated as a surrogate daughter for the Queen. Caroline was seen as an intelligent and attractive young woman, and was a sought-after bride. A match between Archduke Charles of Austria and Caroline was proposed, but Caroline refused to convert to Catholicism, and so the marriage proposal was dropped. In 1705, Sophia Charlotte died, and this devastated the princess, leading her to sickness at times. That same year, Prince George of Hanover met Princess Caroline, and they fell in love with each other. On the 22nd of August 1705, they were wed in Hanover. On the 20th of January 1707, Caroline gave birth to their first child, Frederick. However, by July of 1707, Caroline fell ill with smallpox and pneumonia. Her husband cared for her devotedly and caught the illness himself. They both survived. Throughout their marriage, they had 7 more children: Anne, Amelia, Caroline, George, William, Mary, and Louisa. Their marriage was a loving marriage, although George did keep mistresses. Caroline was well aware of this, and he had told her about them. Caroline was faithful to her husband, and she kept her husband's mistresses as ladies-in-waiting to keep an eye on them. In 1714, Caroline's grandmother-in-law, the Dowager Electress Sophia, died at the age of 83, and Queen Anne of Great Britain died 2 months later. Caroline's father-in-law became King George I of Great Britain. Caroline and George, along with a few of their children, travelled to England towards the end of 1714. Their eldest son and heir, Prince Frederick, remained in Hanover for the entirety of George I's reign. Shortly after George I ascended the throne, Caroline's husband was invested as Prince of Wales, and Caroline received the title Princess of Wales, the first in 200 years. As George I was divorced and had not remarried, Caroline was the highest-ranking woman in Britain. Both Caroline and George made an effort to learn the English language, the people, politics, and customs of the land. 2 separate courts developed as a result, one that was composed of the king's German courtiers and ministers, and the court of the Waleses, composed of mostly English nobles and far more popular with the British people. After the baptism of their son William George, the couple fell out of favour with the king and were banished from the king's household. Their children remained in the care of the king. George and Caroline greatly missed their children and visited without approval of the king. Eventually, the king allowed the couple to visit their children, especially when their infant son became seriously ill. The baby died, however, causing extreme grief for the parents. In 1727, George I died and Caroline's husband became George II. Caroline became Queen Consort, and their joint coronation was held on the 11th of October 1727. Caroline was close to the Prime Minister Walpole, and though George wanted to remove Walpole from office, Caroline advised her husband to retain him as the leading minister. Caroline was quite liberal in her political opinions. She supported clemency for the Jacobites, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. George and Caroline did not have a good relationship with their eldest son Frederick, Prince of Wales. Due to their poor relationship and behaviour of their son, the Regency Act of 1728 made Caroline regent when her husband was abroad in Hanover. As queen, she surrounded herself with artists, writers and intellectuals, and spent much of her time in London. As she grew older, her health began to fail. She suffered from gout in her feet and an umbilical hernia after the birth of her final child. In November 1737, Caroline was suffering from intense pain in her intestines. Part of her small intestine had poked through the hernia. Over the following days, she was bled, purged and operated on without anaesthetic, as was the custom of the day. However, her condition did not improve, and her husband refused the Prince of Wales to see the Queen, something she agreed with. On the 17th of November 1737, Caroline's strangulated bowel burst, but she lingered for 3 days before dying on the 20th of November 1737. Frederick was not invited to her funeral, which occurred on the 17th of December. Her death was mourned by both Protestants and Catholics. Her compassion and morality made her popular and helped to counteract much of the unpopularity of her husband and father-in-law. Born Sophia Charlotte on the 19th of May 1744, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Parents were Charles, Duke of Mecklenburg, Prince of Mirau, and Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen. She was given a rudimentary education in botany, history and language, with a particular focus on household management. Once her brother Adolphus Frederick succeeded to the throne, she gained more duties. As a princess, Charlotte was expected to marry, particularly to a wealthy, powerful prince or monarch. As she was from a politically insignificant German duchy and had no interest in politics, Charlotte was seen as an ideal bride for the unmarried British monarch George III. On the 8th of September 1761, Charlotte and George married. Charlotte could speak no English but quickly learnt the language, speaking with a strong German accent. Only a year later, the heir George was born, and they would go on to have 14 further children, of which 2 died in childhood. Charlotte and her mother-in-law, Princess Augusta, Dowager Princess of Wales, had a strained relationship. Augusta appointed much of Charlotte's staff, and they would report back to Augusta on Charlotte's behaviour. As such, Charlotte was not able to form long-lasting, trusting relationships with the English people of her court, and most of the companions she brought with her from Mecklenburg became her close friends. The royal couple's official residence was St. James's Palace, where they conducted business. But by 1762 they had moved into Buckingham House, and as the Queen spent more time there, it became known as the Queen's House, with most of their children being born there. Both of them preferred the countryside, and Kew Palace and Windsor Castle became places where they could have a domestic life that they wished for. Though Charlotte did not take much interest in politics, she did keep herself informed on any developments, especially ones pertaining to German issues, such as the Bavarian succession. In 1765, the king had a bout of mental illness that Charlotte's mother-in-law, Princess Augusta, did not make Charlotte aware of. The Regency Bill of 1765 was passed, which meant if the king became incapacitated, Charlotte would be regent. As the king's illness was only temporary, Charlotte was not made aware of either the bill nor her husband's condition. In 1788, the king's mental and physical health failed, distressing the Queen. The Prince of Wales and the Queen butted heads over who would assume the regency should the King's condition be permanent. Another bill was introduced in 1789 declaring the Prince of Wales regent if the King was permanently incapacitated. However, the King recovered and resumed his duties, negating the need for a regent. The Queen's mental health was also affected by her husband's condition. Quick to temper and distress, she no longer enjoyed musical concerts and public engagements which she had loved in the past. Her relationships with her children also deteriorated. Her only source of solace was gardening. From 1804, as the King's mental health declined, Charlotte avoided him as much as she could. Both George and Charlotte adored German music, awarding musicians such as Mozart and Bach special honours and promoting German music in Britain. Charlotte loved plants and had a keen interest in expanding her gardens by introducing non-native plants. She is also credited for introducing the Christmas tree in Britain. Women's education was an important topic for the Queen. Having received an inadequate education herself, she set out to ensure her daughters did not suffer the same fate. However, she restricted their independence and refused to allow them to marry until they were older. Because of this, none of her married daughters had any surviving children. Charlotte and Queen Marie Antoinette of France had a close friendship, sharing a love for music and art. They often confided in each other about their struggles through pen and paper. At the outbreak of revolution in France, Charlotte was prepared to accept the French royal family into her home and even prepared rooms for them. However, Charlotte was devastated upon hearing the news of their executions. In her later years, Charlotte's husband George was declared insane in 1811, and their eldest son George became regent. As the highest-ranking female member of the royal family, Charlotte served as a hostess for official functions, but her popularity declined as the years went on. On the 17th of November 1818, Charlotte passed away in Kew Palace in the presence of the Prince Regent. At 57 years, she is the longest-serving female consort of a British monarch and the second longest-serving consort of a British monarch after Prince Philip. Caroline of Brunswick was born on the 17th of May 1768 to Charles, Duke of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel, and his wife, Princess Augusta of Great Britain, one of the sisters of George III. Her childhood was difficult as her father was openly cheating on her mother, and this created a toxic environment for her, and she was unable to be friendly to one parent without the other scolding her. Caroline received a limited education, never being able to properly spell correctly, although she could understand German, English and French. She also lacked contact with members of the other sex, even for a woman of her time. At the wedding of her elder brother, Charles, she was allowed to dance for the first time, but only with the groom and her brother-in-law, the Prince of Orange. Though there were a number of matches suggested for Caroline, including the Prince of Orange and the Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, none came to fruition. Caroline fell in love with an Irish man, but because of his status, they were forbidden to marry. On the 8th of April 1795, Caroline and George, Prince of Wales, were married. They were first cousins. They had not met before, only meeting days before the wedding. Both were disappointed in their future spouse. During the marriage, they only had relations 3 times. However, that was enough for a child to be produced. Almost exactly 9 months after their wedding, on the 7th of January 1796, Caroline gave birth to Princess Charlotte. George had numerous mistresses, and the relationship between the married couple deteriorated further. They led separate lives and lived apart from each other. George prevented Caroline from seeing their child as much as possible. Though pleased to have an heir, George still wanted a son to ensure the line of succession and tried to engage with his estranged wife. However, this was unsuccessful, and the couple only had one child, Charlotte. Having only one child was not enough for Caroline, and so Caroline adopted 8 children from poor families and fostered them out to families in the community. Allegations of affairs on Caroline's part were brought up as a possibility for George to divorce his wife. However, there was no foundation for these allegations and they were proven false. After her husband became Prince Regent, Caroline was further restricted from seeing her daughter. She was not invited to state events and was excluded from court. In 1814, Caroline chose to leave Britain for the continent, moving between countries like Italy and Switzerland. In 1816, Princess Charlotte married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, and a year later, in 1817, she gave birth to a stillborn son, and subsequently died. Caroline discovered the fate of her daughter and her grandson from a passing courier and was devastated by the death. She had lost her daughter, but also her only chance of regaining a position at court once her daughter became queen. On the 29th of January 1820, George III died and Caroline's husband became king. Her situation became worse. Caroline was not treated like a queen, and though popular with the ordinary people of Britain, she was immensely unpopular with the nobility and royalty throughout Europe. On the 19th of July 1821, Caroline was barred from entering Westminster Abbey for the coronation. That night she fell ill, and 3 weeks later, on the 7th of August 1821, she died. Her official cause of death was intestinal obstruction, but theories of cancer and poisoning have also been suggested. Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen was Queen of the United Kingdom from 1830 until the death of her husband William IV in 1837. Adelaide was the eldest child of George I, Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, and Louise Eleanor of Hohenlohe-Langenburg. Saxe-Meiningen was a small state that did not bar women from ruling. However, it was not until her brother Bernard was born in 1800 that primogeniture was enacted. In 1817, Princess Charlotte of Wales died and George III had no living legitimate grandchildren. Each of his unmarried sons married quickly, including William IV. Even though Adelaide was from an unimportant German state, as there were no other options and any deals William had made with other candidates have fallen through, he married her on the 11th of July 1818, having only met her the previous week. Though not in love, they settled into a married life in Hanover and were devoted to each other. Soon after their wedding, Adelaide became pregnant, but gave birth prematurely to a daughter, Charlotte, on the 27th of March 1819. Charlotte lived only a few hours. They decided to move back to England to ensure that any further children they had would be born on English soil. However, Adelaide miscarried and had stillbirth children throughout the rest of their marriage. The only other living child they had together was Princess Elizabeth, who was born on the 10th of December 1820. She sadly passed away when she was only 3 months old on the 4th of March 1821. Adelaide and William had no surviving children together. In 1830, George IV passed away and William succeeded as king. William conferred the rangership of Bushy Park to Adelaide, allowing her to live at Bushy House for the rest of her life if she so wished to. Adelaide and William were jointly crowned on the 8th of September 1831. Adelaide was loved by the British people and she was very charitable, giving a large amount of her income to charity. Both William and Adelaide were fond of their niece, Princess Victoria of Kent, and wished to care for her, but were often thwarted by Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent. In June 1837, William died, and his niece Victoria acceded the throne as Queen Victoria. Adelaide had poorer health as the years progressed and moved to warmer countries like Malta. She passed away on the 2nd of December 1849. Prince Albert is best known as the husband of Queen Victoria. He was born on the 26th of August 1819 into the ducal family of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. His parents were Princess Louise of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg and Ernest III, Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. His father inherited the dukedom of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg and combined it with his duchy to become Ernest I, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert had one brother named Ernest. His father was almost twice the age of his mother, and it's not really surprising with such an age gap that the relationship was doomed to fail, especially with his father's infidelities. Deeply upset and heartbroken by this, Louise took on lovers. She did not hide this, and it led to a toxic and unhealthy environment for a young boy to be growing up in. It was not long before his parents split in 1824. Albert's father gained custody of Albert and Ernest, and Albert never saw his mother again. His forced abandonment of Albert by his mother would cause irreparable damage to Albert and influence his future marriage to Queen Victoria. His mother married her lover Alexander von Hunstein, later died of cancer in 1831. His father married his niece Princess Maria of Württemberg. Albert did not look up to his father and was determined to be a better man than his father. He threw himself into his studies at the University of Bonn and excelled. As was often the case with royal families, his family wanted to arrange a marriage between Albert and his first cousin Princess Victoria of Kent, the heir to the British throne. Though Victoria was impressed by the prince, she was not ready for marriage, and in the first years of her reign, marriage was the farthest thing from her mind. Marriage between cousins was common in royal families, and the implications of consanguinity was not as well understood as it is today. Since his birth, his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, had been planning his marriage to Victoria, and there was a mutual agreement between the families. However, that caused a lot of pressure on the shoulders of the young prince, especially when many of the other suitors also fought for the Queen's hand in marriage. In 1839, Prince Albert visited the United Kingdom, and his arrival did not go unnoticed by Victoria. She found him to be very handsome, greatly matured, and his demeanour pleasant. It did not take long for her to propose to him in October 1839, and he accepted. Her proposing broke all the social construct at the time, and it set a precedent for their marriage. The couple wed on the 10th of February 1840 in a show of great wealth, and it was like something from a fairy tale. Victoria and Albert had a wonderful honeymoon in Windsor Castle, and as a result of their racy evenings together, the natural consequence in a time when contraception was almost non-existent, resulted in Victoria becoming pregnant soon after the wedding. Victoria was horrified and felt this was spoiling her fun as the newlywed. Albert did not share that opinion and was delighted to become a father. He also did not share his wife's opinion that newborns were ugly. He promised to be a better father than his father had been, and wanted their growing family to be a model for how a family should be. On the outside, it appeared that the royal family were perfect, however, that was far from the reality. Victoria had a volatile temper, and she and Albert could get into very loud screaming matches. Albert had been warned not to retaliate in case it caused Victoria to develop the same mental illness as her grandfather, George III. Oftentimes, Victoria would refuse to speak to Albert, and they would only communicate through notes. The concerns of his wife becoming mad came to fruition when, after one of their children was born, Victoria began to experience hallucinations. Albert was not the most sympathetic of husbands when it came to his wife. He was annoyed and impatient with his wife and could not understand her lack of control. As well as psychological health, their physical health was also under risk. Only months after their wedding, the couple went out for a carriage ride. Victoria was pregnant with their first child. The deranged Edward Oxford jumped out of the crowd and shot at the couple with a loaded pistol, intent on killing the Queen. The couple survived, and Oxford was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to Australia. Another hard blow for the couple was the birth of their first child, named Victoria. They had hoped for a son and heir, and Victoria proclaimed that their next child would be a boy. She was correct. Although she had hoped to wait before having another child, as a consequence of being close to her husband, Victoria gave birth to a son only 1 year later, named Albert and nicknamed Bertie. The couple would go on to have 7 more children: Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Albert was determined to mould his children into model princes and princesses, and was especially hard on Bertie. What was unusual about Prince Albert was his input into the care of his children at a time when men took very little interest in their children. Albert expected perfection from them, and was quick to devise an educational regime for his children that bordered on abuse. While his eldest daughter Victoria was very naturally academically inclined, his eldest son Bertie was not, and Albert was harsh on Bertie. Albert punished his children with corporal punishment when they did not meet his expectations. Albert was jealous of his wife. As she grew older, she became more confident in her abilities and refused to let Albert take over, especially when she was pregnant. It led to Albert being unsatisfied in his role as Prince Consort. Victoria allowed Albert to make changes to their household as a way to make up for their differences in power. She even allowed him to fire her old governess, Baroness Lazen, after their eldest daughter became ill under the Baroness's watch. With Lazen gone, Albert took control of the household, and the marriage was mostly harmonious. Prince Albert was never the most healthy of people. As a child, he was prone to falling ill, and this continued into adulthood. Suffering from fatigue and bowel issues, Albert would often run himself ragged, working long hours and not resting nor relaxing. Shortly before Albert's death, Bertie became submerged in drama. He lost his virginity to an actress while stationed in Ireland. Albert and Victoria heard of this and were appalled, especially Albert. It brought up old memories of Albert's parents and their adultery. Albert went to Ireland in late November 1861 and talked to his son about the damage he was causing. Albert then returned to the United Kingdom, but not before catching a chill. The chill worsened into a fever and worsened Albert's already poor health. Albert died weeks later on the 14th of December 1861. Queen Victoria blamed Bertie for the death of her beloved husband, and she remained in mourning for the rest of her life.